The house was already burning by the time I understood the truth. Flames clawed at the walls, smoke pressed down like a living thing, and the air itself shrieked with heat. Out of all of us, only 2 managed to stumble into the night alive. The fire consumed the rest, and with it the fragile illusion that had held the evening together. But even as I coughed into the cold air, skin blistering, lungs screaming, I knew the numbers were wrong. I had invited 5 friends. That made 6 with me. Yet somehow, when the night ended, there had been 7 inside. That was the problem, and it was the problem that would haunt me long after the fire reduced the house to ash. I have turned those hours over in my mind again and again, replaying them with the obsession of someone who knows they missed the detail that mattered. I can trace each arrival, each smile, each casual word. The pattern seems simple, and yet within its simplicity lies the fracture that destroyed us. The day itself was ordinary in every way. I spent the afternoon preparing, setting out snacks, arranging the table, ensuring the firewood was stacked neatly. It was winter, sharp and unforgiving, and I wanted the house to feel warm, alive. I thought of the evening as a chance to forget routine, to surround myself with laughter and familiarity. The thought comforted me as I moved through the rooms, lighting candles, checking the clock. There was nothing strange about that day until the first knock on the door. Dina and Angelo arrived together. I remember it clearly. I was in the kitchen laying out plates when I heard their voices in the hall. They shook off the cold, stomping boots on the rug, laughing as they brushed snow from their coats. There was relief in their presence, an anchoring that told me the evening had begun. They greeted me with warmth, their smiles effortless, their movements familiar. No one else stood behind them. I know this for certain. Kay arrived not long after. I had been watching the driveway, waiting for her. For months, I had toyed with the idea of asking her out, circling the courage but never quite catching it. Tonight, I told myself, might finally be the moment. She knocked alone. She stepped inside alone. She smiled at me with that nervous warmth that always unsettled me. 3 guests so far. With me, 4. Later came Christophe and Marina. They arrived together, their voices carrying through the night before they even reached the door. That brought the total to 5. Add me, 6. Exactly as planned. I counted them as carefully as I had counted the plates. Everything matched. The evening settled easily at first. We gathered in the living room, the fire crackling, the warmth spreading through the house. Drinks were poured, snacks were passed. Conversations spilled from one corner to another, stories overlapping in the way they always did when comfort set in. For a time, it felt perfect. I remember thinking the balance was right. 6 people, 3 pairs of energy, voices rising and falling in harmony. It felt like safety.
We decided to play cards. It was Angelo who shuffled, his hands practiced, his laughter filling the pauses. He dealt quickly, mechanically, until the numbers betrayed us. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then another. 7. It should have been nothing. A slip, a laugh, a quick correction. But the silence that followed was heavier than it should have been. We all noticed. Even Dina raised an eyebrow, tilting her head as if to confirm what she had seen. I forced a smile, brushing it off. But inside, unease stirred. The number was wrong. From then on, the night tilted. I could not stop counting. Every time I looked around the table, I tried to fix the number in my mind. 6. It should have been 6. Yet sometimes when my gaze slid across the faces, I thought I saw one more. 7 shadows, flickering in the firelight. 7 voices overlapping in conversation. The trouble with memory is that it resists certainty. I told myself I knew my friends. I knew their faces, their gestures, their voices. And yet in that room, familiarity blurred. I thought I heard Christophe speak, that Marina's lips were moving. I thought Kay was laughing, but the sound came from the opposite side of the table. Even Dina and Angelo, who had arrived together, seemed to fracture, their voices splitting into separate echoes that didn't quite align. I tried to shake it off. Drinks, laughter, games, these things should have buried doubt. But doubt has a way of feeding on itself. Once it begins, it does not stop. I found myself staring at the door, certain it had opened again without me noticing, but each time I checked, it remained closed, still, innocent. The clock edged toward midnight. Shadows deepened. The warmth of the house began to feel oppressive. I looked at the faces around me and felt them blur. I knew them, but I didn't. I counted again. 6, then 7, then 6. My head spun with the math of shadows and bodies. The mistake came again in the cards. Angelo dealt too many once more. His hands moved as if controlled by something else, spreading them across the table until 7 lay there, undeniable. I laughed nervously, pretending it was nothing, but the laughter felt hollow. The others joined in, but even their voices seemed uncertain, as if they too felt the wrongness but refused to name it. The conversations grew stranger after that. Words overlapped. Questions were asked without answers. Sometimes I thought I was speaking, only to realize the sound had come from someone else's mouth. Sometimes I thought I was silent, only to hear my own voice cutting through the room when I hadn't moved my lips. Reality folded in on itself, blurring the line between memory and imagination. I began to wonder if the house itself was playing tricks. I had lived there for years, knew its creaks and drafts, but that night it felt unfamiliar. Shadows moved where no one walked. The fire flickered as if disturbed by breath that did not belong to us. I caught glimpses in the corner of my eye, faces that vanished when I turned, hands withdrawing into the dark.
Still, no one admitted anything was wrong. We smiled. We laughed. We carried on as if the evening were normal. But beneath the surface, tension pulsed. Each of us, I think, felt it, the sense that someone did not belong. It was not until the fire began that panic shattered the pretense. One moment, the house was filled with laughter, the next with smoke, thick, choking, merciless. Flames spread too quickly, as if they had been waiting. Chairs toppled, glass broke, screams filled the air. I remember grabbing Kay's arm, pulling her toward the door, stumbling through the smoke. I remember the heat clawing at my skin, the sound of wood splitting, the rush of collapse. I remember bodies moving, frantic, desperate. And then silence. Cold air, night sky. Only 2 of us standing in the snow, coughing, gasping, staring back at the inferno. The others were gone. But even in that moment, even with the fire consuming everything I owned, one thought consumed me more than the flames. There had been 7 inside. 7 voices, 7 shadows. I had invited 5. With me, it should have been 6. Somewhere between laughter and smoke, someone else had joined us. And whoever they had never left.
The fire left nothing but ash and memory. When the last flames collapsed into embers, when the sirens faded into the distance, I stood among ruins that no longer felt like mine. The air was sharp with smoke, my clothes heavy with soot, my lungs raw. Beside me, the only other survivor stared into the wreckage with hollow eyes. I cannot even tell you now who it was. Memory fractures when pressed too hard. In one version, it was Kay, her face pale, her hands trembling. In another, it was Angelo, coughing, muttering curses under his breath. Sometimes I think it was Christophe, his voice rasping as he asked questions I could not answer. Each time I recall it, the survivor changes. The only constant is me. And the certainty that there should not have been 7. The authorities came, of course. They asked questions, clipped and efficient. How many were inside? Who escaped? Did I know how the fire started? My answers wavered. I told them 6, because that was the truth I had planned. 5 guests and myself. 6. But when I spoke the number aloud, it felt like a lie. My throat tightened around it, my lungs rejecting the sound. The officer's pen scratched across paper, fixing my words in ink, sealing a version of reality that I no longer believed. They never found all the bodies. The fire had been too fierce, the collapse too complete. In the ruins, they uncovered fragments, but not enough to match the count, not enough to give me certainty. Each discovery was presented as if it should comfort me, evidence that my friends had died quickly, that they had not suffered long. But the gaps in the count grew wider with every fragment. There was no way to prove whether 6 had perished or 5, no way to prove whether the 7th had ever been there at all. Nights became unbearable after that. I dreamed of the fire constantly, though the flames were not always the same. Sometimes they whispered. Sometimes faces appeared in the smoke, mouths moving without sound. Sometimes I heard laughter echoing through the crackle, the same laughter that had filled my house before everything burned. I woke drenched in sweat, convinced that someone else was in the room with me, convinced that the seventh had followed me out. I tried to anchor myself in logic. Trauma warps memory. Panic bends perception. I told myself that what I had seen was confusion, that stress had made me miscount, that fear had blurred the edges of the night. But each time I repeated the explanation, I felt it crumble. The details did not fade as hallucinations should. Instead, they sharpened. The memory of that extra hand reaching for cards, the sound of a voice that had no face attached, the glimpse of a shadow moving when all my friends were seated. These things remained, stubborn as scars. The survivor, whoever they were, drifted from me in the weeks that followed. At first we spoke constantly, clinging to each other as the only witnesses, but gradually the calls grew shorter, the meetings rarer. They avoided my eyes when we crossed paths, their voice uneasy, as though afraid of me, or perhaps afraid of the memory we shared. Eventually they stopped answering altogether. One day I realized I had not seen them in months, and then I realized I could no longer remember if they had ever truly survived at all.
Loneliness became obsession. I began to retrace the night in detail, writing down every movement, every sound. I charted the order of arrivals, the pattern of voices, the seating around the table. I studied photographs from earlier gatherings, comparing faces, searching for inconsistencies. But instead of clarity, I found only more uncertainty. In some pictures, there were 6 of us. In others, 7. I could not tell if I had altered the photos myself, or if the 7th had always been present, hiding in silence. Neighbors whispered. They wondered aloud why I had survived when others had not. Some said they saw me wandering at night, muttering numbers under my breath. Others said they heard laughter from my empty house long after it had burned. I ignored them, but their words cut. Each rumor fed my doubt. Each whisper made me wonder if I was already slipping into madness. Yet, the 7th presence remained. At times, I caught it in mirrors, a reflection standing just behind my shoulder, vanishing when I turned. At times, I heard footsteps in the hall, though I lived alone. At times, I found objects moved, chairs pulled from tables, glasses left half full. Small things, always deniable, always easy to dismiss. But denial grew harder with each occurrence. One evening, I set 6 plates on the table, out of habit. When I returned to the kitchen for water, there were 7. I stood frozen, staring at the extra plate, the fork placed neatly beside it, the glass already half filled. My pulse roared in my ears. I tried to convince myself I had miscounted, that I had said it unconsciously. But deep down, I knew. The 7th had claimed its place again. I began to avoid company. Friends who tried to check on me were turned away. I could not explain to them what haunted me, could not risk them becoming part of it. I lived in silence, curtains drawn, nights spent pacing from room to room. Sleep abandoned me. When I closed my eyes, I saw the fire, the cards, the 7th shadow rising behind us. It was during one of these sleepless nights that I found myself counting aloud, over and over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again and again until the numbers blurred into noise. And then, faint, but undeniable, I heard another voice join mine, whispering, 7. I froze, breath caught in my throat. The voice was not mine. It came from the dark corner of the room, where the shadows seemed thicker than they should be. I did not move. I could not. The silence that followed pressed harder than the voice itself. From that night on, the 7th was no longer content to remain hidden. I felt it closer, pressing at the edges of every moment. When I showered, I saw the curtain shift as if brushed by a hand. When I walked through the hall, I heard footsteps behind me, perfectly matched to mine, but always a half beat late. When I ate, I felt eyes on me, unseen but insistent, waiting for me to acknowledge them.
The boundary between memory and present collapsed. Sometimes I found myself back at the table, cards spread before me, smoke already curling under the ceiling. Sometimes I heard my friends laughing, though I could no longer remember their faces clearly.
Sometimes I thought I was dreaming, only to wake and find the chair across from me pulled out, as if someone had just been sitting there. I tried to escape the house, to leave the town altogether, but the seventh followed. In hotel rooms, I counted the pillows and found one extra. On buses, I saw reflections in the windows of figures who were not seated. In crowded streets, I felt a presence just behind my shoulder, never touching, but always there. The seventh had bound itself to me. It is difficult to explain what that does to a mind. At first, I clung to anger, to the idea that I had been cursed, singled out. But gradually, anger dissolved into resignation. I began to accept the presence as inevitable, as constant as breathing. I no longer asked why. I no longer sought escape. I simply lived with it, counting and recounting, knowing the number would never balance again. Some nights I think about the fire and wonder if the seventh caused it. Perhaps it lit the flame, unseen, waiting for chaos to spread. Perhaps it wanted to consume the others, leaving only me as witness. Or perhaps the fire was never real at all, just another trick to bind me to its game. I will never know. The authorities closed their files long ago. The world has moved on. Only I remain, trapped in the arithmetic of shadows. And yet, there are moments when I wonder if the seventh is not a stranger at all. Sometimes its gestures seem too familiar. A tilt of the head like Kay, a laugh like Christoph, a movement of the hands like Angelo. It is as though the seventh wears their faces, borrowing them one by one, reminding me of what I lost. Perhaps it is not a single presence, but the echo of all of them, gathered into one. Perhaps the fire never took them. Perhaps they live still, merged into something I cannot name. I write this not for clarity, but for record. If someday I vanish, if someday I am found with ashes in my lungs and soot on my skin, let it be known that I did not die alone. There will be another, unseen but certain, standing just behind. The count will always be wrong. I invited 5 friends. With me, there should have been 6. But there will always be 7.